Today is December 31st, 2024, the 366th day of the year. You didn't need me to tell you that because we all use the same calendar, the Gregorian calendar. But where did this calendar come from? And why did we choose it? Today on Analysis, we'll explore the origin, adaptation, and evolution of the Gregorian calendar, along with things like timekeeping and time zones. You can call me Analyst or Ann, and this is why we use the Gregorian calendar. To start off, it might actually be the 1st of January for you. Happy New Year's. That's because we have time zones. Later in the video, we'll talk about time zones. For now, we'll start at the beginning of the Gregorian calendar. The earliest version of the Gregorian calendar is the Roman calendar. Around the time this calendar was being used in Rome, most regions of the world were kind of doing their own thing. Since I don't want to talk about 100 calendars, and you probably don't want to hear it, we'll stick to Rome, since we use their stuff nowadays. The Roman calendar had 304 days. It had 10 months, which are now March through December, and didn't really account for winter. It was likely made to accommodate for festivals and seasons for planning, etc. Eventually, they needed to start taking winter into account because that's a whole season, and without it, the calendar would often fall out of sync with our seasons. This is where the Roman Republican calendar comes in.
Yeah, I look good 24/7, 24/7. All your 10s, I'm an 11, I'm an 11. Wanna know how? I don't be stressing, cause I look good 24/7. I'm hot 24/7.
The Roman Republican calendar has 12 months. They added what we now know as January and February, which is good for me because those are my two favorite months. And this calendar had 355 days instead of 304. You might notice 355 days is about 10.25 days less than what we have now. If you didn't know, our current calendar is the closest we have to the way our planet orbits the sun. So that big of an offset is going to introduce some drift. One guy, you might know him, changed this. Julius Caesar evolved the Roman Republican calendar into the Julian calendar, which more closely resembles what we have today.
Hello, it's me. The Julian calendar had 365.25 days, the decimal representing the leap days, which was one leap day every 4 years. But the Julian calendar isn't the Gregorian calendar. What could have possibly changed? Well, even the Julian calendar had drift. The Julian calendar had a drift of about 1 day every whopping 128 years, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that calendar was in use for about a millennia and a half, about 1,627 years, so actually over that. It drifted by roughly 10 days. The Gregorian calendar fixed that.
So much laughter, hey. Immensity of the age.
In 1582, after several centuries of using the Julian calendar, it was changed one final time. Pope Gregory XIII instituted the Gregorian calendar. The Gregorian calendar, what we use today, changed some things. Leap years, instead of one leap day every 4 years, are now one leap day every year that's divisible by 4, unless they're also divisible by 100, with an exception being made if they're also divisible by 400. That gives us about 365.2425 days per year, which is really close to the actual time it takes the Earth for a full revolution, which is 365.2422 days. This still does have a drift, but it's like one day every 3 millennia, so we don't have to worry about that. Along with changing the leap years, they also shifted forwards by 10 days to align it with the Earth's revolution. This is how the Gregorian calendar came to be. Now, why do we use it? Let's go back to the Julian calendar. This was the version of the Gregorian calendar that was used by Rome the longest. The Julian calendar was adopted in 46 BC, while Rome was still a republic. During Rome's republic era, they spread through what we now know as Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, Croatia, Slovenia, Montenegro, Albania, Serbia, only parts of it, Switzerland, Belgium, the Netherlands, only the western parts, Tunisia, Algeria, North Macedonia, Greece, Bulgaria, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and a lot more. For most of these territories, they adopted the Julian calendar. Some of them had a dual calendar system with the Julian calendar and the traditional ones, but most of them assimilated with the Julian calendar. This expansion was very important to the globalization of the Gregorian calendar because when the drift was corrected, everyone that was on the Julian calendar was like, okay, we can just skip 10, well, not just skip, we can skip 10 days and our calendar would be 25 times more accurate. That jump wouldn't be so easy for all of those territories if they were on a different calendar. The thing is, the expansion carried out by Rome wasn't even the biggest thing to happen to the Gregorian calendar. Enter the 16th century. We now focus on places like England, France, and Spain. All three of these territories used the Julian calendar. Let's go to 1582. The Pope, at this time Gregory XIII, institutes the Gregorian calendar. Now, one of the main reasons for the Gregorian reform was to help accommodate for Christian events on the calendar, but more specifically, Catholic events. Can you guess who's not going to adopt the Gregorian calendar until the 18th century? Correct, Protestants. England, one of the biggest powers at this time, was a Protestant power, so they stuck with the Julian calendar for a while. We'll get there, but for now let's focus on the Gregorian reform. After the Pope established the Gregorian calendar, Catholic majority nations like France, Spain, Portugal, Poland, Italy, and others were pretty quick to adopt it. With this, their colonies in the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Oceania had to adopt it too. But some Protestant majority nations still hadn't adopted it. And these were pretty big ones too, like England, Denmark, and Sweden. Until they did it anyways, because between the 17th and 18th centuries, a lot of Protestant majority nations like the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, among others, namely England, also made the switch to the Gregorian calendar. Even by this point, a lot of nations had not budged for a while, namely Russia and Greece, among others. Russia made the switch in 1918 during the Russian Revolution, and Greece did it in 1923. By this point, if you weren't on the Gregorian calendar, you would be left in the past, because that's what most trade and international relations operated on, especially because most of the world's biggest powers were using it. And by the time computers came around, it was pretty much wraps because the computer was invented in the United States, which used the Gregorian calendar. I mentioned in the beginning of the video that I wanted to talk about time zones, because even though they're not directly part of the Gregorian calendar, they still shift the calendar globally by a few hours, so I wanted to implement it here at the end. We've been measuring time for a really long time. Since before 1500 BC, we've been measuring time, originally using the sun as a reference, but I'm not going to dive into that. My point is, time, as in 24 hours and 60 minutes and 60 seconds, was here before the Julian calendar, which was established in 46 BC. We refined keeping time based on when the sun reached its peak at noon for each region respectively, up until the 19th century. When industrialization began to become more complex, we started getting things like trains, and as you may remember from the last video, telegraphs started to emerge around this time. Realizing that we needed a more standardized way to measure the differences in time, a bunch of leaders from around the world got together, decided that Greenwich, London is the center, or the mean time, and developed a system for the offsets in time. The way time zones work is we have the center, which is Greenwich Mean Time, or GMT, and it sits at 0 degrees longitude. Time zones are offset by 1 hour in bands of 15 degrees. So, for example, JST, Japan Standard Time, is 9 hours ahead of GMT because it's 139 degrees to the right of Greenwich, which places it in the 9th band to the right of Greenwich. So it's 9 hours ahead because 135 divided by 15 is 9. I hope you're still with me here. Also, for time zones, it's not just like uniform lines around the world. There's also like borders for countries and stuff and states where they it kind of becomes a little more complicated, but they're based off the lines. With the Gregorian calendar and time zones, we measure the date in an effective and uniform way across the globe. The history of the Gregorian calendar is one packed with a very long history full of disagreements between powers, evolution to align with the orbit of the Earth, and many, many other complexities. I hope you've learned about the Gregorian calendar in this video, and if not, I hope it was at the very least entertaining. Happy New Year's, and I hope you all enter the Gregorian year 2025 happily and safely. This has been Analysis, and this week we analyzed why we use the Gregorian calendar.